The Denver Search and Rescue Unit was one of the most respected teams in the country, known for their elite K-9 division. And at the heart of that team was Storm, a golden Labrador retriever with an impeccable track record. He wasn't just a rescue dog. He was a legend. For years, Storm had been the first to leap into collapsed buildings, the first to sniff out survivors under avalanches, the first to find lost hikers in the Rocky Mountains. His keen nose and fearless nature had saved dozens of lives, earning him awards, media attention, and the admiration of his handler, Sergeant Tom Reeves. But all of that ended on one fateful mission. It was supposed to be a routine rescue. 2 hikers lost in the mountains after a sudden blizzard. The team had been deployed at dawn, pushing through the knee-deep snow, guided by Storm's instincts. His tail wagged as he caught a scent, and without hesitation, he dashed ahead. Then came the snap. The snow beneath him collapsed. Before anyone could react, the ground swallowed Storm, sending him plummeting into an unseen crevasse. Tom screamed his name, rushing forward as ice and snow cascaded down around his dog. By the time they reached him, Storm was lying at the bottom of the ravine, whimpering, his hind leg twisted unnaturally. It took 2 hours to lift him out. The vet's verdict was devastating. Severe ligament damage. He could still walk, but he'd never run again, never jump, never work a search and rescue mission. To Tom, Storm was family. To the Denver Search and Rescue Unit, he was an asset, and a broken one at that. 2 days later, Captain Jack Hudson, head of the division, called Tom into his office. "I know this is hard," Hudson said, leaning back in his chair. He was a man of cold efficiency, with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for cutting out weakness. But Storm is no longer fit for duty. You know what that means. Tom clenched his fists. He can still live a good life. "He's a working dog, Tom, not a pet," Hudson interrupted. "We don't have the resources to keep an injured dog who can't perform. We need to euthanize him or send him to a shelter." Tom's stomach twisted. He had heard stories about those retirement shelters. Overcrowded, understaffed. Old service dogs left to rot in cages. "No," Tom said. "I won't let that happen." Hudson's eyes narrowed. "Then get rid of him yourself. But make it quick." Tom left that office with a decision already made. That night, under the cover of darkness, Tom drove Storm far away from the city, toward the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The Labrador sat in the passenger seat, wagging his tail weakly, unaware of what was happening. When Tom reached the edge of a dense forest, he pulled over. His hands trembled as he opened the car door. Storm looked up at him, trusting, loyal. "I'm so sorry, buddy," Tom whispered. Then, fighting back tears, he unclipped Storm's leash and ran back to the car. He drove away without looking back. Behind him, Storm limped through the snow, confused and alone. The only sounds in the silent night were the howling wind and the distant growl of a truck fading into the darkness. The sun had barely begun to rise over the Rocky Mountains when Storm woke up, curled beneath a fallen tree, his golden fur coated in frost. His body ached. His injured leg throbbed with a dull, relentless pain. But worse than that was a confusion. Where was Tom? Where was the team? His ears perked up at the sound of rustling branches. A coyote? A bear? Instinct kicked in. Storm had been trained to detect danger. He tried to stand, but the pain in his hind leg made him whimper. He collapsed back into the cold earth, breathing heavily. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and something else, water. He needed to move. With a slow, agonizing effort, Storm dragged himself forward, his injured leg barely holding him up. The instincts that once made him a hero now kept him alive. He followed the scent, pushing through the underbrush until he heard the soft babble of a nearby creek. Storm stumbled to the water's edge, lowered his head, and drank deeply, his reflection rippling in the surface. His own face stared back at him, a dog that had once been a champion, reduced to a stray. But he wasn't alone. A rustling noise made him lift his head. A figure stood on the other side of the creek. A girl. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with dark brown hair pulled into a loose braid. She wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt, her boots sinking slightly into the muddy riverbank. Beside her, a black and white border collie stood stiffly, ears pricked forward, watching Storm with a mix of curiosity and caution. The girl took a step forward, her eyes filled with concern. "Hey, boy," she said softly, kneeling. "Where did you come from?" Storm froze. His training told him to approach, to listen, to obey. But he had never encountered a human outside of work. He wasn't sure what to do. The girl must have noticed his hesitation. She slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of bread, holding it out. "Are you hungry?" Storm hesitated. He didn't know her. He didn't trust her. But his stomach twisted in pain, and hunger overruled his fear. Cautiously, he limped forward. The border collie let out a low growl, but the girl hushed with a quiet, "It's okay, Rocky." When Storm was close enough, he snatched the bread from her hand and gulped it down. She gave him a small, sad smile. "You're hurt," she murmured, glancing at his swollen hind leg. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." She stood and patted her leg, motioning for him to follow. For a moment, Storm hesitated. Trust was a risk. But then he looked into the girl's eyes. There was no coldness like in Hudson's, no judgment like in the eyes of the men who discarded him, only kindness. And so, for the first time since being abandoned, Storm followed someone new. The ride back to the Doyle Ranch was quiet, except for the hum of the old pickup truck's engine. Storm lay curled up on the seat beside the girl, his tired body sinking into the worn leather. The border collie, Rocky, sat in the back, still keeping a wary eye on the newcomer. The girl, hands steady on the wheel, glanced down at Storm every so often. "You don't have a collar," she murmured. "No tags either. Someone dumped you, didn't they?" Storm didn't move. She sighed and shook her head. People can be real cruel. A few minutes later, the truck rumbled to a stop in front of a modest ranch house, its red barn standing tall against the golden morning sky. Fenced-in pastures stretched beyond the house, where a few horses grazed lazily. The moment the girl stepped out of the truck, a teenage boy came jogging out from the barn, his boots kicking up dust. "Who's that?" he called out, eyes widening at the sight of the Labrador in the passenger seat. "I found him by the creek," the girl answered, reaching in to help Storm down. He flinched slightly, but she moved gently, careful not to touch his injured leg. "He's hurt, Mike. Badly." Mike knelt beside them, his hazel eyes full of curiosity and concern. He was maybe 15, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, his hair slightly messy from the early morning chores. Storm lifted his head slightly, sniffing the air. There was no threat in the boy's scent, only warmth. Mike extended a hand. "Hey there, buddy." Storm hesitated, then, ever so slowly, pressed his nose against the boy's palm. Mike grinned. "He's a good one." "I think so, too," the girl said softly. "But he needs help." Together, they guided Storm into barn, where a small, cozy stall had been cleared. Clean hay covered the floor, and a thick blanket had been folded in one corner. Mike filled a metal bowl with water, while the girl carefully ran her fingers over Storm's swollen hind leg. The Labrador tensed, expecting pain. But her touch was gentle, her voice soothing. "It's okay," she whispered. "I won't hurt you." Storm let out a slow breath and relaxed. "Think he's chipped?" Mike asked, watching as his sister wrapped a cool, damp cloth around the swollen area. "Maybe," she replied. "But something tells me no one's coming for him." Mike frowned. "Then can we keep him?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she met the Labrador's tired amber eyes and whispered, "Do you want to stay?" Storm didn't move, but for the first time in days, his tail gave the smallest wag. The girl smiled. "Then welcome home, big guy." Storm's recovery was slow but steady. Every morning, Annie Doyle, the girl who would save him, cleaned and wrapped his injured leg, using cold compresses to keep the swelling down. She spoke to him in a soft, reassuring voice, her patience endless. Mike, her younger brother, had taken upon himself to help Storm regain his strength. At first, it was just short walks around the barn, then longer ones across the fenced pasture. Storm limped at first, his muscles weak from exhaustion, but every day he grew stronger. The Doyle Ranch became his new world. He quickly learned the routines. The early morning feedings, the scent of fresh hay and damp earth, the sound of horses neighing in the distance. Rocky, the border collie, had finally accepted him, though their relationship was more of a quiet truce than a friendship. And then there was Annie. Storm had never known what it meant to be truly loved. He had always been a tool, a working dog, measured by how useful he was. But Annie treated him like family. She stroked his fur at night, when the cold mountain wind howled outside the barn. She whispered to him as she bandaged his leg. She didn't expect him to be perfect. She just wanted him to be okay. And for the first time in his life, Storm felt safe. But safety never lasted long. One crisp autumn afternoon, Annie was walking Storm near the edge of the property, where the hills sloped down toward a winding road. She let him off the leash, trusting him to stay close. His golden fur shone under the afternoon sun, his body stronger than ever, though his hind legs still carried a faint stiffness. Mike had taken out his phone to snap a picture when a strange black SUV pulled onto the road below. Storm froze. His ears perked up, his tail lowered, and then, for the first time in weeks, he whimpered. Annie followed his gaze and felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Two men had stepped out of the SUV. They wore dark uniforms, their movement stiff, authoritative. But it wasn't the men that made Annie's heart pound. It was the Denver Search and Rescue emblem on the side of the vehicle. Mike frowned. "Annie isn't that?" "Yes," she whispered. The men scanned the area as if searching for something. For someone. Storm backed away, his breathing ragged, his golden eyes full of fear. And in that moment, Annie knew. They were looking for him. She placed a hand on Storm's head and whispered, "We need to go. Now." Annie's heart pounded as she tightened her grip on Storm's collar. She could feel the tension in his body. His muscles coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. His golden fur bristled, his ears flicking back, waiting, watching. Mike swallowed hard. "Annie, what do we do?" She forced herself to think fast. They were too exposed on the open hill. If those men looked up, they'd see them standing there, and there would be nowhere to hide. Annie knelt beside Storm and whispered, "Come on, boy. We have to move. Stay close." She didn't run. Running would only attract attention. Instead, she turned calmly and started walking back toward the barn, her heart hammering with every step. Storm limped beside her, his breathing shallow. He didn't understand everything, but he understood fear, and he could tell that something was very wrong. Mike walked just behind them, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. "They're looking around," he whispered, "like they're searching for something specific." Annie clenched her jaw. "They know he's here." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. How? She had told no one about Storm. Not a soul. Had someone seen him? Had someone recognized him? Or worse, had Captain Hudson been looking for Storm this whole time? They reached the barn just as a third man stepped out of the SUV. Unlike the others, he was wearing a standard search and rescue uniform. He was dressed in a gray suit, his sharp gaze scanning the area like a hawk. Annie felt a cold chill slither down her spine. Jack Hudson. Annie shoved open the barn door, guiding Storm inside. The Labrador didn't protest. He trusted her. She latched the door shut behind them. Rocky, the border collie, lifted his head from where he had been resting in the corner, ears perking up at the tension in the air. He sensed a danger immediately, standing and moving to Annie's side. Mike exhaled sharply. "What now?" Annie forced herself to stay calm. She knelt in front of Storm, placing both hands on his face. His golden eyes met hers, full of uncertainty. "Listen, buddy," she whispered. "No matter what happens, I won't let them take you." Storm licked her hand, his body trembling. Outside, the sound of gravel crunching made Annie's blood run cold. The SUV had stopped at the entrance to their property. Seconds later, a sharp knock echoed against the front door of their house. Mike's face paled. "They're here." Annie took a shaky breath. "Then let's make sure they don't find what they're looking for." The sharp knock at the front door sent a jolt through Annie's body. She barely had time to think before Mike grabbed her arm. "You have to go out there." Annie's throat felt dry. "What?" "If you don't, They'll start looking around, he whispered urgently. You need to keep them at the house. Keep them away from the barn. He was right. If Hudson and his men started searching, they would find Storm. Annie turned to the Labrador. He was sitting completely still, but his eyes flicked toward the door, his body tense. He knew something was wrong. She pressed a hand to his head. Stay here, okay? Rocky let out a low growl, pacing beside Storm like a protective shadow. Mike grabbed a handful of hay and tossed it over Storm's blanket. I'll stay with him, he whispered. Just get them off the property. Annie inhaled sharply, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the house. When she stepped onto the porch, Jack Hudson was already waiting. He looked exactly as she had imagined, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and sharp, calculating gaze. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his expensive gray suit, his expression unreadable. 2 men in search and rescue uniforms flanked him, their posture stiff. Miss Doyle, Hudson said smoothly, I'm sorry to bother you. Do you have a moment? Annie forced herself to breathe normally. Sure. What's this about? Hudson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. We're looking for a missing dog, a golden Labrador. He was last seen in the foothills near here. His eyes flicked past her toward the pastures. Have you noticed anything unusual? Annie's heart slammed against her ribs. This was it. She had 2 choices, lie or stall for time. She crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral. I see a lot of animals around here. What's so special about this one? Hudson tilted his head, studying her. He's a trained search and rescue dog, a valuable one. Annie fought to keep her voice steady. You mean valuable like you'd pay someone for him? One of the men shifted uncomfortably. Hudson's smile didn't waver. I mean that he belongs to us. His gaze sharpened. And we intend to take him back. Annie tightened her grip on the porch railing. He doesn't sound like he ran away, she said carefully. Sounds like someone got rid of him. Hudson's expression didn't change, but Annie saw it, the slight tightening of his jaw. For the first time, she knew he wasn't here to rescue Storm. He was here to erase a mistake. She clenched her fists. I haven't seen any dog like that. Hudson held her gaze for a long moment. He didn't believe her, but he wasn't going to push it. Not yet. Finally, he exhaled and turned back toward the SUV. If you do see him, he said, stepping inside, call me. As the vehicle pulled away, Annie felt the weight of his warning settle in her chest. This wasn't over. It had just begun. Annie stood frozen on the porch, her fingers gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. The black SUV disappeared down the road, leaving behind a trail of dust. But she knew better. This wasn't over. She turned and sprinted back to barn, her boots kicking up dirt. The second she pushed open the door, Mike and Storm were waiting, both of them tense, their eyes locked onto her with the same unspoken question. Are they gone? Mike whispered. For now, Annie said. She knelt beside Storm, running a hand through his golden fur. But they'll be back. Hudson didn't believe me. Mike's expression darkened. Then what do we do? Annie exhaled slowly. We need to get Storm out of here. Mike frowned. Where? We can't just take off in broad daylight. If they're watching the roads. I know, Annie interrupted, but we don't have a choice. She glanced at Storm. His ears were lowered, his tail tucked. He understood the urgency, even if he didn't understand why his old handlers wanted him back so badly. Annie cupped his face gently. I promised you I wouldn't let them take you. Storm licked her hand, his amber eyes full of trust. That was all the confirmation she needed. They waited until sundown. Annie packed a small bag, bottled water, medical supplies, and enough food to last a couple of days. She and Mike saddled up their horses, knowing they couldn't take the truck. If Hudson had someone watching the roads, they needed a way out that wouldn't leave a trail. Storm wasn't used to horses, but he trusted Annie enough to follow her. His hind legs still gave him trouble, but he pushed forward, never hesitating. Mike led the way down the back trail, a narrow, rocky path that wound through the foothills. They moved quickly, the sky darkening above them. But something fell off. The hairs on Annie's neck prickled. She turned slightly, scanning the hills behind them. And that's when she saw it, a pair of headlights in the distance, bouncing as a vehicle navigated the rough terrain. Her stomach dropped. They found us. Mike looked back, his face pale. How? Annie's heart pounded. I don't know, but we have to move. Now! She urged her horse forward, Storm breaking into a run beside her. His injured leg slowed him, but fear fueled his stride. The headlights grew closer. The roar of an engine echoed through the quiet night, and Annie knew they were out of time. The roar of the engine grew louder, bouncing off the hills as the SUV barreled toward them. Dust and gravel kicked up in its wake, the headlights bouncing wildly over the uneven ground. Storm whimpered, his breath coming in sharp pants as he tried to keep pace. His injured leg was slowing him down. Annie felt a surge of panic. They were gaining on them. They're going to catch us. Mike yelled over the wind. Not if she could help it. Annie yanked the reins, guiding her horse toward a tree line at the edge of property. Get to the woods. They can't follow us through there. Mike followed, kicking his horse into a gallop. Storm hesitated for half a second, his body trembling with exhaustion. But he pushed forward, following Annie into the darkness. Behind them, the SUV skidded to a stop, its tires screeching. Annie risked a glance back just in time to see two men jump out. One of them had a flashlight, the other a tranquilizer gun. Her stomach dropped. They're not trying to take him back, she whispered. They're trying to take him down. Mike paled. What? A sharp whistle rang out through the air. Storm skidded to a stop. His body stiffened. His ears flicked. A command, one he had been trained to obey. No! Annie screamed, grabbing his collar. Storm whined, his instincts warring against his trust in her. Then, a sharp pop. A dart shot through the air, grazing Storm's side. He yelped, stumbling as his legs weakened beneath him. Panic flooded Annie's chest. Storm, no, stay with me. But he was already swaying, his body growing heavy as the tranquilizer took hold, and the men were closing in. Storm's legs buckled beneath him, his golden fur rippling as he struggled to stay upright. His breathing was fast and uneven, his body fighting against the tranquilizer coursing through his veins. Storm, no, stay with me. Annie dropped off her horse, barely catching him before he collapsed completely. The men were getting closer. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trees. The tranquilizer gun was still raised. Stay back, Annie shouted, shielding Storm's body with her own. One of the men hesitated, glancing toward his partner. But the second man, the one holding the gun, wasn't stopping. Move, girl, he ordered coldly. That dog belongs to us. Annie's blood boiled. He's not an object. He's not a piece of equipment. He's alive, she spat. And you threw him away. The man didn't even flinch. Orders are orders. Behind her, Mike was still on his horse, hands tightening on the reins. Annie, he whispered, we can't fight them. Annie's fingers curled into fists. Every instinct in her body told her to run. But how? Storm couldn't move. His breathing had slowed, his body limp against hers. If they took him now, she knew what would happen. He would disappear, and no one would ever know. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Think, think, think. Then a sharp bark cut through the air. The men turned. From the trees, a blur of black and white streaked toward them. Rocky, the border collie, moved like lightning, his teeth snapping at the man's arm. The tranquilizer gun clattered to the ground. Rocky, no. Mike yelled, but it was too late. The man stumbled back, cursing as he grabbed for his radio. We need backup. Annie's pulse spiked. More of them were coming. This was it. Their only chance. She grabbed Storm's limp form and turned to Mike. We have to go. Now. Mike didn't hesitate. He reached down, grabbed Storm, and pulled him onto the horse's back. Annie swung up behind him, holding the Labrador tight. Rocky fell back, his eyes wild with adrenaline, but he understood the mission. He sprinted ahead, leading the way through the trees. Behind them, the men yelled into their radios, their voices fading as Annie and Mike disappeared into the night. But they weren't safe yet. They had nowhere left to run. The wind howled through the trees as Annie gripped Storm tightly, her arms wrapped around his limp body. Mike urged his horse forward, dodging low-hanging branches, while Rocky sprinted ahead, his tail flicking like a beacon in the dark. Behind them, shouts and snapping twigs signaled that Hudson's men weren't giving up. They're still coming. Mike called over his shoulder. Annie's mind raced. The ranch was too far. The main roads were too dangerous. They needed a place to hide, somewhere the search team wouldn't think to look. Then she saw it. To their right, a narrow mountain trail cut through the trees, winding toward the edge of a rocky cliffside. It was risky, but it was their only chance. There! Annie pointed. Take the ridge trail. Mike hesitated. That's a dead end. Exactly, she said. They won't expect us to go that way. Mike clenched his jaw, but didn't argue. He yanked the reins, steering the horse toward the steep incline. The climb was brutal. Rocks crumbled beneath them, Storm's weight making it harder to balance. Annie could feel his shallow breaths against her arm. The tranquilizer was still in his system. He didn't have much time left before his body shut down completely. They reached the top just as the first flashlight beams pierced through the forest behind them. They're almost here, Mike panted. Annie scanned the ridge. There was only one option left. A small cave, half hidden by overgrown brush, nestled into the side of the cliff. It wasn't deep, but might be enough. There, she pointed. Mike slid off the horse and helped Annie carry Storm inside. The Labrador barely moved, his head lolling against her chest. Rocky pressed against him, his ears pinned back as they crouched in the darkness, hearts pounding in sync. Seconds later, the sound of boots crunching against stone. Hudson's men had reached the ridge, and they were trapped. Annie held her breath, pressing herself against the cold stone of the cave as the men's voices echoed through the ridge. They came this way, one of them muttered. They have to be close. The flashlight beam swept across the rocky terrain, growing closer with each second. Storm stirred weakly against Annie's chest. His breathing was slow but steady. He was still out of it, but the tranquilizer's grip on him was beginning to loosen. Mike gripped her arm. What do we do? Annie's mind raced. They couldn't run. They couldn't fight. They had to outthink Hudson. The wind picked up, swirling dust and loose gravel across the ridge. One wrong step from Hudson's men, and they could slip. The drop was at least 50 feet straight down. Then she had an idea. A risky one. She turned to Mike. Give me your phone. What? Just do it, she hissed. Mike handed it over, and Annie quickly scrolled through his contacts. She found what she was looking for, Sheriff Cole Garrett, a longtime friend of their late father. The sheriff was one of the few men in town not under Hudson's influence. If anyone could stop this, it was him. She hit dial. The phone barely rang twice before his gruff voice answered. Mike? What's going on? Annie's voice was urgent but controlled. Sheriff, it's Annie. Hudson's men are on our property, trying to take a dog we rescued. They shot him with a tranquilizer and are hunting us down. We're trapped in a cave on the East Ridge. There was a pause. Then, stay put. I'm on my way. The call ended. Annie handed the phone back to Mike, whispering, Now we just need to stall. Mike swallowed hard. And if they find us first? Annie exhaled. Then we make them think twice about taking another step. She reached for a loose rock beside her and tightened her grip. If this was going to end, she wasn't going down without a fight. Outside, the voices grew closer. And then Jack Hudson's voice rang out. Annie Doyle, he called. You can't hide forever. Annie's grip on the rock tightened. This was it. Annie's heart pounded as Hudson's voice echoed through the ridge. You've had your fun, but this ends now, he called. His tone was cold, calculated, like he had already won. Mike shifted beside her, whispering, He's bluffing, right? Annie wasn't so sure. Hudson was a man used to getting what he wanted. If he thought she and Mike were just scared kids, he'd have no problem forcing them out. She took a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the rock in her hand. Then footsteps, the crunch of boots against loose gravel. They were close. Annie forced herself to stay calm. Sheriff Garrett was coming. She just had to hold them off long enough. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, Hudson continued, stepping closer. but you're trespassing on search and rescue property. That dog is ours." Annie finally spoke, her voice steady and sharp. "You abandoned him." A pause. Hudson let out a low chuckle. "You don't know what you're talking about, sweetheart." She clenched her jaw. Sweetheart, like she was some clueless girl who didn't understand how the world worked. "You left him in the woods to die," she snapped. "And now you want him back? Why? Because you're afraid people will find out what you did." Another pause, this time longer. She had hit a nerve. "You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" Hudson finally said, his voice quieter, but deadly serious. Annie didn't flinch. "Yes." Then, from the distance, the sound of sirens. Hudson stiffened. So did his men. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness as two sheriff's trucks pulled onto the ridge. Annie exhaled. They had made it. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the rocky ridge as the sheriff's trucks came to stop. Jack Hudson stiffened, his cold confidence flickering for the first time. His men exchanged uneasy glances, their hands twitching toward their radios. Then a car door slammed. Sheriff Cole Garrett stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. His presence was solid, unwavering, a man who had seen enough lies to recognize one before it even left a man's mouth. "Jack," the sheriff called out. His voice was calm but firm. "Got a call about some folks trespassing on private property. Imagine my surprise when I find it's you." Hudson smiled, but it was tight. "This is what it looks like, Sheriff." Garrett lifted an eyebrow. "So it's not you and your men chasing down a couple of kids in the middle of the night over a half-conscious dog?" Hudson's expression darkened. "That dog is government property." Annie had enough. She stepped forward, Storm's weight still against her side, and met the sheriff's gaze. "That's not true," she said, her voice strong despite the exhaustion. "They abandoned him. I found him half-starved, shot up with tranquilizers, and left for dead." Garrett studied her carefully. Then his sharp eyes flicked back to Hudson. "That true?" Hudson didn't answer, but Annie wasn't done. "He was injured," she continued, her voice rising. "He wasn't useful to them anymore, so they threw him away. And now, the only reason they're here is because they don't want people to know what they did." One of Hudson's men shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Garrett let the silence stretch before he nodded. "That's what I thought." Then he turned to his deputies. "Confiscate their weapons. We'll sort the rest out at the station." The sheriff's men moved in immediately. Hudson's face twisted in frustration. "You can't do this," he hissed. Garrett gave him a flat stare. "I just did." The men were disarmed. The tranquilizer gun was handed over to the deputies. And just like that, Hudson lost. Annie felt Storm stir against her, his body still weak, but his tail gave a faint wag. They had won. The tension finally broke as Hudson and his men were escorted to the sheriff's trucks. The distant hum of the radios, the clinking of handcuffs, and the murmurs between deputies filled the cool night air. Annie exhaled, her body sagging with relief. It was over. She looked down at Storm, who lay weakly against her side. His golden fur was still matted with dirt, his breathing slow, but his tail gave another small wag. "Looks like you're finally safe, buddy," she whispered, scratching behind his ear. Sheriff Garrett approached, his sharp eyes softening as he took an exhausted dog. "He's yours now," he said simply. Annie's breath hitched. "What?" Garrett sighed. "Hudson's got bigger problems now than chasing after a dog. And even if he tries, well, he smirked. Let's just say I wouldn't bet on him winning this one." Mike let out a breathy laugh of disbelief. "So he's really ours?" Garrett looked at Annie. "He's been yours since the moment you refused to let him go." Annie's throat tightened. She had fought so hard, risked so much, and now Storm was truly free. She knelt beside him, cupping his face. "Hear that, boy? You're staying." Storm nuzzled into her palm, his amber eyes filled with something she had never seen in them before. "Peace." Mike grinned. "We should probably get him home before he passes out again." Annie laughed, wiping her eyes as she and Mike gently lifted Storm onto the horse. As they rode back toward the ranch, the weight that had been pressing on Annie's chest for days finally lifted. Storm wasn't just a rescue dog anymore. He was home,